and planning. So with him, we basically have set up a lot of collaborations in a lot of indigenous pueblos, and Navajo Nation, and Canada, and Ecuador, and Mexico, especially in Puebla, which we traveled, abroad several times to Mexico, especially to Puebla. And with the University of UAP, La Benemérita Universidad Autónoma de Puebla, UAP, so we have a huge, extensive collaborations with Puebla as well. The other thing that I've been involved with, Ted, in past years, he actually taught me to do a Nambe studio, Nambe Pueblo, where we actually assisted the community in developing like their new, not new, but their old plaza, which just trying to revitalize that. The other project that I worked on was in Zuni Pueblo. We actually did a studio on Main Street, and from there, the art walk, and many other projects that I've been involved with. And then recently, they set up the India Pueblo Cultural Center. It was the Pueblo, Contemporary Pueblo Architecture Exhibit. I might be not getting it right. That's where I actually constructed an adobe wall with a bunch of volunteers. So if you guys have a chance, go visit the India Pueblo Cultural Center. It's an amazing exhibit that Tehohola, Lim Paxton, and I forget the other person, Marth, I forget her name, last name, Ted. But so they put a really wonderful exhibit together. And the other thing is that he recently retired, but really he's working harder now than he's ever been working on it. And I think that's about it. So with that, if you guys have any questions, I'll let Ted probably introduce himself. So with that, thank you guys.
Okay, good morning everybody. I hope you can hear me okay. I couldn't follow anything that Francisco had said, but I'm sure what he said to say was pretty good. He's been a great colleague of mine for years and is an affiliate of the institute that I founded in 2012 called the Indigenous Design and Planning Institute, which is part of the School of Architecture and Planning. So before I launch into my presentation, Hinumo Puyim Kerimba. So greetings from the Pueblo of Isleta, one of the great nations of New Mexico. As I love to say, we're 7 lucky minutes south of Albuquerque, but I'm sure all of you pretty much may be acquainted with our casino, which that used to be its basic mantra when it first opened up. But of course, as with lots of places, urbanization has caught up with us, and sometimes if there's an accident on the freeway, that 7 minutes can turn, it seems like, into 7 hours. I apologize for not being there in person. I actually have been looking forward to meeting with all of you in person. Last time I was on the Highlands campus was when my mentor, Agnes Dill, who was founder of the Native American Women's Association, and her family visited the campus there in order to establish a special scholarship for Pueblo women in Highlands University, because that's where they graduated from way back when. Some of you who know Agnes Dill passed away in 2012 towards the end, 3 months shy of her 100th birthday. But she mentored me when I grew up in the community, and always just to the very end was a remarkable woman with a memory like a sponge, and just miss those conversations that I used to have with her. But with that, I just like to sort of give you the benefit of some of the kind of learning that I've gone through in my decades of being both at the university but also pursuing my passion of how is it that we can explain community change, in particular looking at it from a indigenous planning lens. As many of you know, I've been doing a lot of work in the area of indigenous design and planning, and continued discussions and conversations with colleagues all over the world now on how this is actually applied and how, in fact, it's informed by the kind of ancestral knowledge that we have within our own indigenous communities. And of course, now with the kind of challenges that we're facing with climate change and also now, unfortunately, economic kinds of chaos and downturns, all these kinds of social systems that are at play at this particular point, how it is that our communities survived in the face of all of these kinds of what I call attempts to transform us into the other, and the resiliency then that we were able to use and adapt in order to be able to move forward and continue in the way that we still do and function to this very day. And I think it's really appropriate to kind of place it within the context of historic preservation, although we kind of push against the notion of preservation per se. You know, we understand it, but really we see it more from the standpoint of our own momentum and how it is that we have built our own notions of sustainability and resiliency in the face of outside forces and impositions in order to think of us more in terms of a dynamic entity that continues to innovate and move forward, but yet at the same time maintain the kind of core of what it is that's fundamental to our own identity. So I'd like to share this in terms of thinking about what it is that we've begun to develop as the kind of the mainstay of our own scholarship, which is called PlaceKnowing, and to use this as a way in order to get you to think about how it is that maybe the types of efforts that you do within your own communities really begin to model this in terms of how it is that we begin to even think about a new language of looking at community development. So I'm going to move to my PowerPoint, which I'm going to share. And as I indicated, really the main thing that we do in terms of why I founded the Indigenous Design and Planning Institute was really to look at how it is that we use culture and identity to help inform community development. And having grown up myself in terms of being both schooled and a practitioner of community development, there are always sort of these nagging kinds of issues with regards to how is it that many of these kinds of practices really became transformative, and instead of solving a lot of our own kinds of considerations and needs within the community, opened up instead a number of challenges which we're still trying to cope with today in terms of how it is that we move and progress through time and space. So I want to begin my story by explaining a little bit about this notion of how we came into being and how this continues to be reflected within the way that we conceptualize and look at the world around us. And certainly from a Pueblo perspective, we look at it from the standpoint of emergence. And that emergence is fundamental to even how it is that we can move through time and space in order to create the places that we still exist on to this day. But as many of you are aware, it hasn't necessarily been a continuous existence. We're not akin to many civilizations that claim that they go back thousands of years, but in fact, even though we have had that presence here and we have had different kinds of opportunities to establish our own footprint within our progression, that is actually changed over time and place. And in some cases, that change has manifested itself in terms of how it made movement in the land, in the landscape, and even in terms of the evolution of the built form which we occupied as we continued through that journey. So what you see here, of course, is a migration spiral. I love this one in particular It's from Salinas. Some of you may know where that's at across the Manzano Mountains here in the central part of New Mexico. But you see this archetype represented not just here in the Southwest, but universally in many places. And for us, what it represents is this kind of journey that begins at our place of origin. And what's so special about this particular spiral here is you see that these little spikes that are on the periphery here represent, in fact, our Mesoamerican calendar. There's actually 19 of these, which coincide with the 264-day calendar and the apportionment of that in terms of how it is that we represent our calendar, not from a lunar orientation, or not from a solstice orientation, but actually from a lunar orientation. And when we begin our journey in terms of what we believe as being our origin, being the center of the earth, we metaphorically moved up from the center in terms of assuming these different levels that we move through. And these levels represent different phases of our journey, but it also represents our own sense of how it is that we came to being, and in particular, how it is that we begin to stage ourselves in terms of our human awareness and our human context. So you can begin to see how this is represented within the landscape. Some of you may know of the Goosenecks area in southern Utah, which is where this picture is taken. But when I went there, it exemplified how it is that we believe that we fundamentally came through the earth and then ended up occupying the Earth's mantle, which is the crust that we see in the horizon. And that from that perspective of what it is that we actually inhabit, it's minuscule compared to the totality of thinking about how it is that the world and the whole ecosystem is actually represented. And that journey in these 5 levels that brought us from the center to the top came with original instructions. And these instructions began to inform how it is metaphorically that we begin to actually continue to understand and relate this in terms of ceremony. Again, this is another excavation that exists at the Salinas Pueblo. And again, what I love about this is that this is from one of our sacred dwellings called the Kiva. And each one of these levels then represents the ascendancy of that journey from the center towards the surface that we now currently represent. And in terms of even the way the architecture itself is evolved and developed in order to represent this, all these elements really, in a sense, help to inform the sacred understanding of how it is that we come into these places at ceremony and remember that journey. So at the very center of the structure, you usually find a small impression and indent that we call the earth navel. And you probably have heard of it from the standpoint of Sipapu or Shepafuda, which is what our Taiwan expression is for that. And then as we move into the entry point, where this was covered by a roof, then we move down a ladder in from the outside straight down into the middle of this. But even from the standpoint of architecture itself, the rungs of the ladders themselves depicted these levels that we ascended and moved up in, so that every time we went into this structure, then it really represented that kind of reminder of how it is that we came to be and how it is that we continue to acknowledge that in terms of our notion of ceremony and place. So when we begin to think about how we begin this movement on the earth and how we begin to move through this mantle, it carried original ancestral instructions. And one of the key to this was how we actually moved through the new lands. And it's depicted in migration, and it's depicted in ancestors. And again, this typology is really important for us to understand in terms of how we interpret the landscape, because if you don't even understand the sort of fundamental underlying principles of how my ancestors began to organize the land, you can't even begin to interpret the orientation that they brought forth in terms of how they depicted things on the land. So you have this spiral. This one is really unique. Again, it's from the Salinas area, which again I should add as one of our ancestral lands for the Pueblo Isleta or the Taiwa people. And it begins with that center place or heart place as we're beginning to reframe it. And as we move out in this kind of progression, it's done in a very deliberate way, because the first instructions then were to build a sense of orientation and to build it in terms of this notion of cardinal direction, and then use this cardinal direction in order to depict and begin to develop this notion of sacred geography as it's represented by the boundaries that we see from the east to the north to the west and to the south. And even from the standpoint of how it's positioned, you'll notice something really important, and that is that in our ancestral way, we do not depict north as being on the top, as we see in cartography today, but actually the east is the most prominent in significance, because this is where we believe that everything is renewed. And of course, it's characterized by the rising of the sun and its journey, but that it's this eastern orientation that becomes the dominant way of beginning to think about how we deal with this notion of positionality. So for those of you, for example, that are invested in look at petroglyphs that are depicted in our region here, you can't really make sense of the orientation if you look at that from the standpoint of thinking that the top of that represents the north, but in fact the top of that represents the east. And if you begin to impose that kind of sacred geography on the line art that's represented in many of these petroglyphs that show pathways and important places, markers, where you have springs and wells or geographic features or other settlements, on and so forth. Just move that orientation around your head, and then you begin to really build that real representation in terms of the mapping that our ancestors wanted to relate to our current society. So that migration then is in a very deliberate and very specific way. So that it begins, of course, in the heart place, and as you go out with each consecutive ring, you notice that there's two aspects of this. One is that a singular journey represents a completion in the directions of going out to the edges of the known world in a deliberate motion. In our particular tribe, it's counterclockwise. Some other tribes and other pueblos see that journey as being clockwise. But again, it represents then where you begin in your purpose of orientation, how you go deliberately in a specific way of staging this movement, and then the completion of that, not after one cycle, but after 4 cycles, because 4 is an incredibly important dimension in terms of how we look at completion and looking at it from the standpoint of cycle. And then the instructions were that we do this 4 times, and then once we've completed that, then we go in the other direction 4 times. So you'll see in many of these instances where you see these kinds of spiral cycles that go one direction and then go on to themselves, that's talking about where it is that these ancestors are in terms of the completion of these journeys. So on the left there, you depict these ancestors in the rock art. And each of these represents a clan, and each clan has its own movement and time and place. And as they move through the landscape, then they establish other settlements, and these settlements then represent the longevity, the long completion of this particular journey. I can say, for example, in our Pueblo of Isleta, we still do come forth in ceremony during the winter time in order to acknowledge all the places that we have lived in before. In the case of my community, we acknowledge around 256 of these village names. So if you just sort of do the math and think about how many generations that represents, what perspective of time, that's enormous. And it also, in a way, kind of explains why our area is so rich in terms of the pattern of a lot of these ancestral sites. I keep losing track of how many sites, for example, have been mapped on state lands, much less federal, much less not having any information about privately owned lands. But there are the thousands, if not in the tens of thousands, of these villages that represent these kinds of life journeys in that standpoint. So why do we do this, and why is that instruction so important to how it is that we come into our sense of consciousness? So think of that spiral now, not as a two-dimensional kind of image, but a three-dimensional image, such as this spiral that's going out that looks kind of like a bed spring. And what this is depicting is that you begin at that hard place, which is represented in terms of our village structure as being the plaza area. Although, as I like to emphasize, plaza is a description that was brought over to the Spanish, but by no means should we think that we did have those kinds of spaces before the plaza came and described it as such, but that these center places and these heart places then, from our own language, then represented where our journey took us and where it is that we came to a place made for us, and that from there then we issued out on these journeys to the four corners of the world. But what it also exemplifies is essentially a journey that elevated our collective consciousness. Because if you think about starting in a center place and then moving outward in this kind of ring dimension, and that at the completion of this, you go back to your center place, then you can go back physically to the place where you evolved. But then from a standpoint of your collective consciousness, you've actually elevated that because you've learned in the process of what exists around the world around you. And that distributed knowledge then is absolutely fundamental to how it is that we think about adaptation. Because when you experience the world around you, then our instructions that take those things that you've seen and that you learn and then bring them back into the heart place. But you don't necessarily take them verbatim, but you innovate or apply them to the places that are endear to you, that you have responsibility for, and then make these places more better and resilient and sustainable as a part of experiencing that kind of journey. So that transformative, elevated collective consciousness then continues to grow with each repeating kind of cycle, and the benefit then that it weighs on what it brings back into our community then is applied within the context of where it is that our places have been built over time. So the overall construction of that then really begins to create a masterful way of thinking about the relationship of place and land and tradition. And that relationship we call matriation, because essentially, fundamentally, what it describes is our Mother Earth's relationship, or our relationship to Mother Earth. And Earth is as depicted as Mother, and certainly for the Pueblo people, it's the core of how it is that we have essentially organized our societies and our communities as a matriarchal society. So what we're seeing here then is a beautiful depiction by a Tewa artist from northern New Mexico, looking at how you imagine this construction for the geography around their villages. And what's key to understanding this is thinking about this notion of boundary. And boundary is very specific to the kind of ecosystems that we inhabit, because there the instructions are you only inhabit enough of those areas where you can then gain and reap then the benefit of those resources that are necessary to sustain you, but also you're aware that you exist in relationship to other places. And those, as you see, are depicted by these other villages that exist outside of the core of the boundary that is being maintained by this particular community. And that idea of outside and community also has its own kind of way of thinking about how we build interrelationships across other communities and across the land. And here we have to kind of debunk a lot of what it is that we've been taught, that somehow it was the outside and its imposition then that began to create these new pathways in what was called the frontier or the unknown. But certainly our people had very much a command of the geography and the territory. They had their own roadways, they had their own systems, they knew landmarks, they knew all of these kinds of things. And they moved through them all the time. And this is what these outsiders were traveling upon. They were traveling upon all these established roadways and connections. And in our ancestral way, this was also done in a very deliberate way. Because you see on the inside of all of these areas where these villages are depicted, these open spaces, these were the ways that represent how it is that we moved over the land. And it can be identified by a biological principle called interstitial space. And interstitial space in biology represents those places where the nutrients flow between the cells that in total then generate and manifest in terms of the physical forms that we have. But somehow those spaces then represent how this movement of these fluids and these nutrients occur. And in the same way then, our ancestors moved through those from place to place as well too. And the way that we did this was by looking at how it is that our clans then settled in time and space, because the other element of looking at this is boundary, but also the directionality and then the depictions of where these kind of sacred geographic markers occur. So they are represented sometimes by mountains. They also depict totems. They also depict life movements. All of these then essentially are organized in basic fundamental ways in order to build a fundamental understanding of how it is that we relate to not only our heart place, but also to those places around us. And each one of those then depicts their own sort of boundary from that particular way. And that interstitial space then allows us to build that kind of movement, but not in a random way, but by how it is that we see that our own clans, essentially in our matriarchal understanding, then moved in these situations in terms of time and place. So my clan, which is the Mohawk and Cardinal clan, represents north in terms of its direction. We have our own history of how it is that we move through that. But then from my mother's side, that's represented, my father's side then represents the Eagle clan. And this kind of idea really didn't come to fruition in my mind until I actually had a chance to go to Peru. And it was when I journeyed to Lima and went to the main cathedral there that I saw some of our relatives, our other indigenous community people there who were artists, and they were painting and selling their paintings to the tourists that were coming in there. And these Incan people came up to me because they somehow immediately recognized that I was not from there. And they had a question for me, and they asked me if I was indigenous. And I said yes. And they got, of course, really excited about that. And then the next question they asked me is, what's your clan? And I said, the Cardinal Magpie from my mother's clan and the Eagle clan from my father. And when I said Eagle clan, they got really excited, and they responded to me and said, you're one of us, because that's our clan as well too. And it was at that moment then that I got this revelation of, gosh, then how is that responsibility carried forward? Because I knew immediately at that point that we established that we had this relationship, that we then were embodied and protective of one another. So I felt safe because I knew that no matter what happened, that they would embrace and take care of me because of that relationship. So that's a long way of going about the fact that of thinking about interstitial space and how our clans moved through this landscape, and then knew as they approached these other places that there were other matrilineal clans that were associated with those that were ours, and that represented then the safe way to move through this landscape, because as soon as you then were able to identify moving to that other community that had that matrilineal clanship, that then you could move safely through these spaces in a very specified and deliberate way, and that journey was represented by sacred movements through this kind of landscape. So all of this then is really very much part of ceremony. If you note here, the main conjuncture of where it is that we've settled in our current life cycle is along the Mother River. In Isleta, our meaning translates to the mother that makes all things green. And as it moves through the center, then in the case of the Tewa, it's depicted by this basket. That basket contains then all the ecology and the nourishment then that's necessary, so that our boundaries that embody then that ecosystem that's necessary to be able to sustain us, and that because we're in a temperate situation, then these clanships are organized furthermore into these moieties, because it's our responsibility to be able to maintain this in terms of our sacred calendar. So our moieties then represent the summer is depicted on the right and the winter on the left. You see the koshari there with the stripes, which go back again to our legend of emergence from the center of the earth, and those corn husks then being the horns that were used to leverage the crack that allowed us to come from the center to the surface that we exist there. So that's that kind of symbolism. And then these moieties then have responsibilities to make sure that these ceremonies are done in reference and appeasement to the progression of the cycles that we rely on in terms of meeting our sustenance and our livelihood in these places. So all of this is by way of saying then, how do we think about a worldview? And in particular, one of the things that I'm always questioned about is, well, what does indigenous really represent? Is it just an indigenous thing? And I say no, because it really represents any place-based community. And I know you in the audience may not necessarily be indigenous, but you may come from place-based communities where our basic notion is that if you occupy an area for successive generations, you cannot begin to help but evolve a worldview. And that is the understanding of the world around you, because the imperative there, as opposed to a lot of mainstream society, which has this kind of verve of going and migrating because of opportunity, and unfortunately doing it in a fashion of use to abuse and then move on to another place. Place-based communities are invested in their places because their next generations have to really succeed those places. So this represents the Tewa worldview from the vantage point of Isleta. You see the Rio Grande in the middle, the mother that makes things green from our interpretation. And everybody comes over here and chides us for saying, well, that's not a really big river, until somebody tells them, well, you're only seeing, in terms of the actual surface flow, about 10% of everything that's going through. And 90% of that is underground because of the unique ecology that we have. And that 90% then goes into the groundwater, and then as depicted here, that sustains the domestic water that we mine in order to support urbanization, which forms the kind of grid societies that we have today. But from our standpoint as Taiwan communities of being self-sufficient, agricultural-based, self-sufficient communities, we relied on gravity flow to create instead this kind of agricultural system upon which it is that we built our particular communities in the shape and the form that we exist. And everything else is then within this kind of bubble, the cardinal orientations, the mountains, the snowfall that we rely on in terms of the cycle of the spring and thaw, and then the monsoons that come in during the seasonality aspect. All of those are tied into then our understanding of how it is that we place and situate ourselves in time and space. But it really brings that affirmation of understanding who it is and who we are and how it is that we move through this particular time and space, and developing then not only our culture but our knowledge in terms of how we depict this. So the manifestation of this really comes in epic forms. And we characterize it and we model it even in terms of our contemporary approach, in terms of what we call 7 generations planning. This is a schematic, of course, of Pueblo Bonito, which we see over here. And this essentially is the manifestation of all the things that embodied in terms of our traditional knowledge. There's hardly anything here that's random, that I would say. The walls in terms of their lunar orientation, and solstice orientation, the kivas, structures depicting wayfinding and the Milky Way, the duality of the plazas here. And when I was talking with one colleague who was a knowledge keeper of the forest from the Menominee philosophy of their understanding of the land, he looked at this and says, wow, he says, you know, that middle part kind of reminds me of the hippocampus. Are you sure this is also not a map of the brain's hemisphere? And I actually had never thought about that, but the more I kind of dig into that, it's kind of like another potential area of journey to sort of bring even more evidence of, you know, how resolute this particular structure is. But the fact of the matter is that, you know, archaeological evidence shows that this took 140 years to construct, and that there were 7 distinct phases in this construction. So if you kind of do the math, that's about 20 years per phase, and that represents approximately, probably in that area, a generation. So when we look at it from the standpoint of community and community development, then we think about it from the standpoint of then how can we talk to people and not base it on abstract notions like, you know, let's plan for 10 years, 25 years, 50 years. That's meaningless in terms of its abstraction construction. Instead, what we ask people to do is imagine that they're the middle generation. Well, how did they get to the place where they're at right now if it wasn't for their parents, their grandparents, and their great-grandparents? And as they move forward, and their children, their grandchildren, and their great-grandchildren, and all of those generations in combination represents the 7 generations then. So to be understand and position yourself in terms of where you are, that's how we depict it. And we basically then say, let's think about how you want to do things for your children or your grandchildren, as opposed to 10 years and 20 years. And as soon as you do that, then you put reality and you actually put a face there, because someone in this community is actually related in that particular way to everybody else. And oftentimes when we undergo these planning processes, a lot of the communities basically say, well, what's your goal in strategic planning? And they always tend to say, well, we want to be able to have a healthy community. Well, what is a healthy community? From our demographic standpoint, a healthy community is that all those generations are there and represented. And if they're not, then we have a challenge and we need to discuss it. The other thing is we also then remind people that the people who began building this structure did not live long enough to see its completion. So from a planning perspective, what was it that was so compelling that they never lost sight of their goals and their objectives? And at the very end of this 140 years then, it came to fruition and this completion of this beautiful, harmonious kind of place filled with all the knowledge that had been born and carried forth. The only other thing I'm going to say, but I don't really have time to go into detail about this, is then what does it represent in terms of completion and cycle? Because as all of you know, after this place was completed, it was abandoned. But there's of course a lot of discussion out there was what was the reason for that, and they occurred to overuse of the resources, climate factors, social, political unrest. But it can also be attributed to just basically the completion of this particular cycle and the life force then that gave us instructions to move from these places to the valley riparian areas that we now currently inhabit. So how do we take linear time and then move it into a different time, which is the most important for us in terms of cycle, and in particular looking at it in terms of cycle of completion? So we see it depicted by these symbols such as the medicine wheel. You're familiar with this because it's represented in terms of our worldview, and that symbol as being the Zia symbol on the state flag. but it also can be seen as being a cycle of completion, whether it's large as a civilization or whether it's individual as in a person's life cycle. So the way that we begin to think about this is to look at it from the standpoint of how do we actually exhibit our own life journey as being a cycle of a completion within our community. And we worked with one community, Isleta del Sur in El Paso, Texas, and working with them, we were able to actually begin to map out how that actually works in terms of this kind of figure diagram. So pay attention to this red line, which represents this line that represents a sine curve, and it basically shows the movement of a circle and a point of tangency, which represents your life journey as you move across that horizontal axis, which represents linear time. So this particular diagram actually shows you exactly how that occurs in terms of movement over time. So as that tangent, which represents your life journey, goes from birth to death, then it maps out that movement. And now if we go back to looking at how this diagram then is adapted to explaining that, then we begin with birth, where we begin to learn meanings, values, language as teenagers. Then we go through tradition, our roles, our skills, and our positionality as adults. We begin to learn responsibility, leadership, become parents, begin to maintain households. As elders, we build larger connections. We pass on aspects of tradition. We have the knowledge of the past. We build that connection to the past, and as we then ebb in terms of our lifetime, then we become the ultimate teachers, the responsibility of being able then to pass that on to the next successive generation. In the context of looking at it from the standpoint of the community and their light bulb moment, we basically said, so then how does your community, in terms of its institutions, support that life journey? And as you can see then, they said, well, we have an interactive learning center for our youngest children. We have a nation-building hub for our teenagers. We have a multi-generational place for our adults. We do gardens and landscaping, which has been our traditions for our seniors. And we're thinking about a senior activity center. But it was the first time that they actually said, well, all these institutions then are there in time and place situated in order to support that life journey and do it in a way then that allows everybody the best quality of life, quality of experience, and to maximize their contribution into the community in terms of thinking about how that experience moves across these places. So it gets to this notion of place knowing and why it is then that we think about the fact that we don't make our places, because I know that a lot of the discussion that is occurring in mainstream society is about making places or placemaking. We actually tested that amongst many of our constituents and asked them, do you understand placemaking? And they said no. And the reason is because our places are already made and that we've inherited that responsibility. And that we then have to take that and make the places that we've inherited better for those that are going to assume them, which undoubtedly is our children, our grandchildren, and our great-grandchildren. And the elders in particular said that our responsibility is to walk the land with our children. And if we don't do that, then we don't make those connections that are important to understanding ceremony, the stories of our landscape, our language, our identity, all these things which make us as being the core of our identity, so that that notion is not place-making, but that notion that's fundamental to us in terms of the maintenance of that culture is place-knowing. So how it's applied in terms of actual practice, I know I'm right at the end of my allotted time, but just very quickly, we've been working with some of our own pueblos that have been taking on new responsibilities, so trying to undo the impacts, particularly of housing and the disruption that has occurred with the collective communal patterns and the disruptions in our hard places. Cochiti launched their effort in order to try and bring life back to the community, and essentially, as they characterized it, bringing our children back into the plaza. Because in this time and this place, there's no life in the plaza. It's become too ceremonialized because everybody lives outside for the amenity, only goes back into the hard place for ceremony or special occasions. In this particular case, 30% of all of the houses in the center place are falling into disrepair, and is really akin to dealing with notions of preservation and those kinds of initiatives, but bringing back really more the notion of what is it going to take in order to bring that life back in there. So we worked with another organization, Atkins Ocean Shade, partnered with them about making that conversation around PlaceKnowing. And basically we use what's called an international venue in terms of meetings in order to make this happen. How that works, the international cafe method is you take an assembly of people from the community and then you identify those areas that are identified as being important to that conversation. In this case, you see we have 5 nodes, and then everybody comes into the convening. We begin by actually walking the land, the plaza, in a multi-generational way, relating stories, bringing all of that to bear, and then we come into this convening and do it in these little collective groups. So they're all distributed, each one has a facilitator, each one has information sets to inform the conversation. But the value of this process is then, as we then have the conversation at each of these workstations, then they discuss, and then after a certain period of time, everybody moves up and goes to the next workstation. And then they do this until they've completed that, and it's only at that point then that we bring the plenary session together in order to share collectively what all had been discussed. And in the case of the summary finding for this particular method, the operative question was, what is tradition? And what we learned from that is that essentially the plaza not only suffered from the impact of housing, but also the imposition of all these amenities that inadvertently had come into the plaza that denuded the plaza, which used to be a riparian, beautiful area replete with trees. And these trees they described as their outdoor learning environments, outdoor classrooms, and that it's collectively where they came in the evenings under the shade, where they tell stories, where they regrouped after ceremony, where they sought shade, where they did activities, all of these. And what happened to them? When the electrical lines came in, when the infrastructure for water and for sewer came in, when gas lines came in, the first thing they said is you got to cut down all those trees because they're going to basically compromise your infrastructure. So they denuded the landscape and they made it inhospitable. And that was really a major important kind of thing. So I just wind down now and basically say that, from our work and where we're headed, it's all about storytelling. It's all about now beginning to bring voice into sharing these experiences as a way to help influence others in terms of how they think about these. Some of you, I invite you to visit and listen to our PlaceKnowing podcast series that It's now in our second year. We're now ramping up for our third year. And those of you, we still have time to see this exhibit on contemporary Pueblo architecture called Restoring Our Heart Places at the Indian Pueblo Cultural Center. It's up until December 7th, and it basically looks at the accomplishments of our own practitioners, both architects and planners who are Pueblo, many of them who have come from the University of New Mexico, who are now responding in definitive ways of exercising sovereignty in both planning and design. We're also invested from my own personal side in reclaiming that rematriation of using my ancestral lands to bring art, language, and storytelling and filmmaking as a way in order to build a mechanism for sharing this in the future. So what's at stake? And I think it's characterized by this painting that was done by a young person from San Diego Pueblo who was 12 years old. He depicted that life journey. The diagonal represents the choices you make in your lives. And if you make choices that move towards the ancestors and the collective wisdom, then your area remains verdant. But if you choose those decisions that are individualistic and are not collective and don't acknowledge the ancestors' knowledge, then you essentially desertify your community, and this is what you're represented with. So, continue to build our own intelligentsia, so to speak, and then as we move on in terms of thinking about why we do and position PlaceKnowing as we do and why it makes that as sort of the operative mechanism for how it is that we go about sustainable community development as based on our notion of how it is that we use culture and identity to inform community development, and also respectfully then engaging by acknowledging that people are beautiful already. That's how we move through our life force. So this just is how you can contact me. So I hope that this has really been of interest and benefit to you. And I thank you for all of your attention.
Hear me, Ted?
Yeah, barely.
Okay. Oh, great. So you get closer. You can hear me here, yes?
Yeah, perfect.
So do you want to ask me a question?
Well, we should. I mean, we got to get on. And if there's a chance, I think it's such a fitting conclusion for our conference. Oh.
Don't leave us, Ted.
Maybe he can hear through the microphone.
Ted, we're going to try to do a little Q&A. We'll relate the question to you.
Okay, great.
Here's something back here, yeah.
Hi there, that was really fantastic. Very much enjoyed that. I want to know that it seems like in your traditions, and I say yours because it's not mine, that there doesn't seem to be a tradition of restoration. When the cycle has completed what it needed to happen in a certain place, it was time to move on. So can you speak to how ideas may be evolving since traditions to what is happening now?
Did you hear any of that, Ted?
No, sorry.
No, you're going to have to keep the questions to one sentence so I can get them back to Ted.
Okay, well, I would just say, as opposed to traditions in the past
As opposed to traditions in the past,
when places were abandoned when the cycle was done,
when places were abandoned, when the cycle was done,
how do people think now about restoration?
how do people think now about restoration?
Well, I think you got a little bit of that from the basic quick thing that I did about Cochiti Pueblo. Cochiti is a good example of a community that has gone through an enormous amount of transformation and challenges. It largely began with the imposition of the reservoir there, the Cochiti Lake Reservoir, which inundated its agricultural lands. And then there was this crazy idea that the Department of Interior had in order to create a mainstay development called Cochiti Lake Development. And then this was all in addition to how HUD housing came in and changed the kind of land use in that particular area. And then how it is that then they've gone through other transformations as a result of Indian self-determination, and one of the communities that is not a casino tribe. So given all of that, then how do they bring that notion of sense of continuity and sense of place back into their particular community, and then really elevating that as being then a priority for setting how they want to now take control of the kind of development that was being imposed by outsiders, and how that then is used in order to, at least at the very level, acknowledge that. And it's a discovery of exploration. I mean, it didn't come to their immediacy, for example, that, one of the main problems was the fact that they had inadvertently cut down all of those trees. And I wouldn't have acknowledged that because we were all kind of focused and centralized on this notion of HUD housing coming in there. Another example, if you have a chance, is go onto the website and look under the Housing Authority for Owenge. They've been the most successful in rematriating their hard place. And they began by wrestling with the land tenure situation, acknowledging the fact that they were in their own ways their own worst enemies, because a lot of the houses that had deteriorated and were no longer occupied was because they couldn't resolve the family disputes that were occurring within these particular properties. And they set on a journey of trying to renegotiate these using their own traditional justice systems in order to free those so that they could bring new families into those places and revitalize these places, but also do it in a way where they not only remodeled them and put all the amenities that were represented in the HUD houses, like electricity and Wi-Fi and everything else in there, running water, all these kinds of things, but not just doing that in a respectful way, but developing housing standards, housing codes that were based on their traditional ways of lifestyle, which included mud plastering. We know the challenges of stucco with adobe, for example. They put all of their utilities underground because they didn't want the sky anymore from a ceremonial standpoint cluttering the views. And they then also began to bring that life in a very deliberate fashion into the plaza itself as well too. So all of those are the kind of reformulation of that in very deliberate and specific ways, and in ways then that we would call the mainstay of what historic preservation is all about, is codifying these and setting an actual deliberate way of making people build a compliance that is better, not just for an individual, but for the collective.
Let's thank Ted very much, and I think we're out of time, but I think I'm going to take away from this the idea of how much we can learn and benefit from the native perspective, and particularly in this time when climate change is going on, and the fact that we can learn from Ted's model of respect for the land, respect for our place. And I think we have a lot to thank Ted for his presentation. So thank you very much, Ted.
think I'm not able to share this, but I wish I was there. Anyway, next time.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, Ted. Thank you so much.
Okay, thanks, Robin.
Okay, we'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.
So we're going to move.